8,000 years ago, a woman died somewhere along the humid coastline of what we now call West Africa. Nobody wrote her name down. Nobody built a monument. The jungle swallowed the place where she fell, and the earth held her bones in silence for longer than most civilizations have existed. She had no idea that 8 millennia later, scientists would pull those bones from the ground, extract something invisible from inside her teeth, sequence it in a laboratory, and send a shockwave through the entire scientific world. Because what they found inside her was not what anyone expected. And for 38 million Black Americans, most of whom have spent their entire lives being told that their ancestry before the slave ships is lost, unknowable, erased forever, what they found changes everything. This is the story of the ancient bones that rewrote Black American history. And it starts with a problem that scientists spent decades believing was completely unsolvable. Africa has the oldest human population on Earth. That is not a theory. That is settled science. Modern humans evolved on this continent somewhere between 300,000 and 350,000 years ago. The genetic diversity inside Africa is greater than the genetic diversity of every other continent on the planet combined. Every non-African population in the world descended from a relatively small group of people who walked out of Africa somewhere between 60,000 and 70,000 years ago, carrying only a narrow slice of the diversity that already existed here. So Africa should be the richest place on Earth for ancient DNA research. It should be the place where our deepest questions about human history get answered. Instead, for most of the history of ancient DNA science, Africa was a black hole. Not because the people were not there, not because the history was not layered and complex and magnificent, but because of the weather. Ancient DNA is fragile. It degrades over time, especially in heat, especially in humidity. West Africa, the region that sits between the Sahara Desert and the Atlantic Ocean, the band of savanna and rainforest where some of the most powerful pre-colonial civilizations in human history were born, has both relentless heat, relentless moisture. The combination chews through organic material. It turns bones to dust. Scientists who tried to extract ancient DNA from West African remains came back empty-handed for years. The samples were always too degraded. The information was always gone. This is not a small problem. West Africa is the ancestral homeland of most Black Americans. The transatlantic slave trade, which forcibly transported somewhere between 12 and 13 million African people to the Americas between the 15th and 19th centuries, drew the majority of its captives from a stretch of coastline running from modern-day Senegal in the north, down through Sierra Leone, Ghana, Benin, Nigeria, and into the Congo Basin. The descendants of those captives are the Black Americans who walk American streets today. And for generations, they have been told that the trail of history ends at the water, that there is nothing to find before the Middle Passage, that the genetic evidence simply does not exist. The bones found in West Africa shattered that assumption. To understand why this discovery is so important, you first need to understand what researchers were working with before it happened. The ancient DNA revolution actually started in other parts of Africa. In 2015, scientists successfully extracted ancient genetic material from remains found in Eastern Africa, in the highlands of what is now Ethiopia, dating back roughly 4,500 years. That study revealed something genuinely surprising. The people buried in that Ethiopian cave thousands of years ago carried genetic signatures from the Middle East and Europe, a reflection of migration events that swept back into Africa after the original Out of Africa movement. This back migration left a fingerprint on Eastern and Northeastern African populations that persists to this day, but it had not reached West Africa, at least not in any significant way. West Africa sat separate, genetically distinct. This was a population that had developed in relative isolation from ancient Eurasian migration events, maintaining genetic lineages that stretched far deeper into the human story. The problem was that nobody could prove it. The bones were there. The history was there. But the DNA kept coming back unreadable. Then came the breakthrough in extraction technology. The key turned out to be where you look for the DNA. For decades, ancient DNA researchers worked primarily with the dense, compact bone of the skull and the long bones of the arm and leg. Those samples, while structurally preserved, were exactly the kind of material that degraded fastest in hot, humid environments. The DNA inside was simply too broken up to read. Researchers then began focusing on a different structure entirely, the petrous bone. The petrous is the hardest, densest bone in the human skull. It wraps around the inner ear. Because of its density, it traps and preserves ancient DNA at a rate that can be hundreds of times better than any other bone in the body. Combined with refinements in laboratory extraction protocols and improvements in sequencing technology used to read ancient genomes even when they are highly fragmented, suddenly you have a key that can open doors that were locked for 20 years. When researchers applied these new methods to West African remains, the results were extraordinary. The bones that sit at the center of this story come from several sites across West Africa, the oldest of them dating back more than 8,000 years. These were not people who lived on the margins of history. Archaeological evidence from the sites where the remains were found shows communities that fished, farmed, traded, and built. They lived in organized settlements. They processed food. They worked with materials that required skill and knowledge passed down through generations. They were fully modern human beings, living fully human lives in a fully complex world. And their DNA tells a story that runs in direct contradiction to what we thought we knew. When the ancient genomes were sequenced and compared against modern populations, the first thing researchers confirmed was what they had long suspected, but never been able to prove. The West African genetic lineage is ancient, profoundly ancient. These 8,000-year-old individuals carry the hallmarks of a population that had been living in this region for a very long time, isolated from the major migration events that were reshaping human genetics in other parts of the world, developing a genetic signature that is distinct and deep-rooted in ways that go far beyond what anyone had previously documented. This was not a population that arrived recently. This was not a population shaped significantly by outside influence. This was the deep root. But the story gets more complicated and more interesting, because when you compare those ancient West African genomes to the genomes of modern West Africans, something unexpected shows up. The population structure of West Africa 8,000 years ago was different from the population structure of West Africa today, meaning the people who live in Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Ivory Coast, and Cameroon right now are not simply the direct biological descendants of the people who lived there 8,000 years ago. There were movements, there were mixings, there were events between then and now that reshaped who was living where. And the biggest of those events has a name: the Bantu expansion. If you have ever done a commercial DNA ancestry test, you have encountered the Bantu. The word refers to a language family, and more broadly to agricultural communities that spread their genetics across a vast swath of sub-Saharan Africa, beginning roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. Starting from a homeland near the border of modern-day Cameroon and Nigeria, Bantu-speaking farming communities began a slow, centuries-long expansion that eventually carried them east to the Great Lakes, south to the Cape of Good Hope, and deep into the central rainforest of the Congo Basin. Wherever they went, they brought iron-working technology, agriculture, and their genes. The ancient West African bones reveal what existed before that expansion fully played out. They capture a snapshot of the genetic landscape before the Bantu wave reached its full extent. And comparing that snapshot to modern populations reveals something that directly affects how Black Americans should understand their own ancestry. It means that the genetic heritage of Black Americans is even older and even more rooted in the West African soil than previously understood. The commercial DNA tests that millions of Black Americans have taken in the last 15 years compare their DNA to reference panels made up of modern African populations. But now we have ancient populations to compare against as well. What the ancient DNA reveals is that some of the genetic lineages that show up in Black Americans trace back not just hundreds of years to the slave trade era, but thousands of years further, to populations that were living in West Africa long before the medieval kingdoms of Mali and Songhai, long before the ancient kingdom of Ghana, long before any of the history that gets written into textbooks. This changes the story fundamentally. For Black Americans, the narrative of ancestry has always been one of rupture. The Middle Passage stood as a wall. Everything before it was assumed lost. The ancient DNA evidence reframes that rupture. Yes, the slave trade was a catastrophe. Yes, names and languages and specific village origins were destroyed by the deliberate brutality of the system. But the genetic line, the biological thread connecting Black Americans to West Africa, does not begin in 1619 or 1776, or at any point in the recorded history of the Americas. It reaches back 8,000 years, maybe further, into the deep African past. The DNA inside a Black American body today carries echoes of people who lived and loved and worked and died in West Africa before any European had ever seen the Atlantic Ocean. Understanding what the ancient bones actually tell us requires a brief look at how ancient DNA research works, because the methodology matters when we talk about what these findings mean. When researchers extract DNA from ancient remains, they are working with fragments, degraded fragments. The double helix that carries genetic information breaks down over time into smaller and smaller pieces. And what survives in an 8,000-year-old bone is not a clean, complete genome. It is more like a shredded book, where many of the pages are missing, and some of the remaining pages are partially burned. The science of ancient genomics is essentially the science of figuring out what the book said from the surviving fragments. Researchers use the known structure of the human genome as a framework, align the ancient fragments against it, and reconstruct the sequence with sophisticated statistical tools that account for the damage and degradation. It is painstaking work. It requires multiple independent verifications. And when it produces a finding as significant as this one, it gets scrutinized heavily before it is accepted. The finding was accepted. The ancient West African genomes were compared against hundreds of modern populations from around the world, including dozens of African populations and populations of African descent from the Americas. The analysis identified specific genetic variants, single points in the genome where different populations carry different versions of a particular segment of DNA that appear in the ancient West African individuals and appear in high frequencies in modern West African populations and their diaspora descendants. These variants are rare or absent in the rest of the world. They are the fingerprints of this ancient lineage. And they show up in Black Americans, not as a faint background signal, not as a marginal trace, as a substantial component of Black American ancestry. Now, no one is suggesting that the ancient lineage has traveled through time without any mixing. The story of human populations is always a story of movement and mixing. Black Americans carry genetic contributions from West Africa, from Central Africa, from Southeastern Africa, and from the forced admixture with European and indigenous American populations that colonialism imposed. The genetic picture is layered. It is complex. That complexity is itself part of the history. But running through that complexity, like a river under the landscape, is the ancient West African lineage now documented in 8,000-year-old bones. It did not disappear. It survived the Bantu expansion. It survived the slave trade. It survived the deliberate destruction of cultural memory that the plantation system enforced. It survived in the bodies of the people who are alive today. There is another dimension to this story that is equally important, and it has to do with what the ancient DNA tells us about the genetic diversity of West Africa itself. One of the persistent misconceptions about African populations is the idea that Africa is genetically homogeneous, that African people are somehow a single, undifferentiated genetic mass. This is not just wrong. It is the exact opposite of the truth. Africa has more genetic diversity than every other inhabited continent combined. The genetic differences between a Yoruba person from Nigeria, a Wolof person from Senegal, a Fula person from Guinea, and a Mandinka person from Gambia are in some cases greater than the genetic differences between a European and an East Asian.
Tide's boosted for smelly work clothes. It's cleaner, whiter, brighter, and fresher. People should absolutely rethink what they know about Harbor Freight Tools. It's a totally different company. My name is Wes Marmley. I'm the Senior Vice President.
We built interim housing to get homeless people off of the streets.
Africa is not the beginning of human genetic diversity. Africa is its greatest expression. The ancient West African genomes add another layer to this picture. They reveal that this diversity is not new. It is not the product of recent history. The ancient individuals from different West African sites already show population structure, meaning they were already genetically distinct from each other in ways that suggest they represented different lineages, different communities, different branches of the West African human family that had been developing separately for extended periods of time. The diversity that characterizes modern West Africa has deep roots. It was there 8,000 years ago, and it is still there today, encoded in the bodies of every person who carries West African ancestry. For Black Americans doing commercial DNA tests, this finding has concrete implications for how to interpret the results they receive. Most commercial ancestry testing companies use what are called reference populations to figure out where your DNA comes from. They take a sample of DNA from people in modern Nigeria and call it Yoruba, a sample from modern Senegal and call it Senegambian. Then they compare your DNA against those modern reference populations and tell you what percentage of your genome matches each group. The problem is that these modern populations are themselves the product of thousands of years of history, including the Bantu expansion and other movements that the ancient DNA is now helping us to see clearly. When a company tells you that you are 43% Nigerian, what they are actually telling you is that 43% of your genome matches a modern Nigerian reference panel. They are not telling you which specific pre-colonial group your ancestors belong to. They are not telling you how far back in time that connection goes. The ancient DNA is beginning to provide that deeper layer of context. It also helps explain why many Black Americans who take multiple ancestry tests get different results from each company. This is not because the companies are wrong exactly. It is because the reference panels are different, and because the underlying genetic reality is more nuanced than any single company's categories can capture. The ancient DNA adds resolution to the picture. It helps show not just where the modern populations are, but how those populations relate to deeper historical lineages that commercial tests are currently not equipped to precisely identify. The research community is actively working to correct this. Several major initiatives are currently expanding the reference panels used in ancient and modern DNA research to include more diverse African populations and more ancient African genomes. The goal is to build a more complete genetic atlas of Africa across time, so that future ancestry analysis can reach past the Bantu expansion, past the medieval era, and into the deep human past, in the way that the 8,000-year-old bones are beginning to make possible. This matters in ways that go beyond individual curiosity about family origins. It matters for medicine. African American populations have historically been underrepresented in genetic databases used for medical research. That means findings about disease risk, drug response, and genetic health factors are often based on data sets that do not adequately reflect African genetic diversity. The more we understand about the specific ancestral populations that contributed to Black American genetics, the better positioned scientists are to build health interventions that actually work for Black Americans. The ancient DNA discovery is not just a history story, it is a health equity story as well. When researchers analyzed the ancient West African genomes, they paid particular attention to a set of genetic markers associated with specific population lineages. Some of these markers are found in what geneticists call haplogroups, family trees of genetic variation. Your haplogroup tells you which ancient branch of the human family tree your direct maternal or paternal line descends from. The mitochondrial DNA haplogroups found in the ancient West African remains include lineages designated L1, L2, and L3. These are among the oldest maternal lineages in the human species. L1 and L2, in particular, are concentrated in sub-Saharan African populations, specifically in West and Central African populations. They are rare in the rest of the world. They are common in Black Americans. Surveys of mitochondrial haplogroups in Black American populations have consistently found that L1, L2, and L3 lineages make up the overwhelming majority of maternal genetic ancestry. These lineages were present in West Africa 8,000 years ago. They are present in Black America today. The chain connecting them is unbroken, even if the names at every link of that chain are not recorded in any book. The Y chromosome data, which traces the direct paternal line, is more complicated in Black Americans because of the significant admixture that resulted from the sexual violence of slavery. European paternal lineages appear at higher frequencies in Black Americans than European maternal lineages. This pattern is consistent with the historical reality that enslaved women were subjected to rape at massive scale, while enslaved men were far less often the biological fathers of mixed ancestry individuals. But even accounting for this, West African paternal haplogroups are found in substantial proportions of Black American men. Those paternal lineages also trace back to populations represented in the ancient West African remains. Among the individuals sequenced from the ancient sites, some show elevated levels of a deeply divergent ancestral signal that geneticists had previously only been able to detect indirectly. For years, researchers analyzing modern West African genomes kept finding traces of an ancient population lineage that did not match any known modern group. It was like finding an ingredient in a dish without being able to identify the ingredient itself. The genetic signature suggested a population that had been present in West Africa for a very long time, possibly tens of thousands of years, contributing to the gene pool of modern West Africans, but never directly sequenced because no sufficiently preserved ancient remains had been found. Some researchers called it an ancient West African ghost population. The ancient bones do not represent this ghost population directly, but they sit closer to it on the genetic family tree than any modern population does. They provide the first real window into a lineage that had previously only been glimpsed through its modern descendants. And that lineage runs through modern West Africans and into Black Americans.
New Game Plus has no business making Grace's dish towel smell.
With credit card. See your top rewards broken out.
The transatlantic slave trade was, among its many atrocities, a deliberate assault on memory. Slaveholders understood that a person who knows where they come from, who knows their family name, who knows the language their grandparents spoke, is a person with a sense of identity that is harder to dehumanize. The systematic stripping of names, languages, family structures, and cultural practices from enslaved people was not accidental. It was policy, and it worked, at least at the level of conscious cultural memory. Most Black Americans today cannot name the specific ethnic group their great-great-great-grandparents belonged to in Africa. Most cannot name the village. Most cannot trace the line back past a certain point where the records simply stop, and the sea swallows everything. But the body remembers what the records do not. That is the profound, almost philosophical implication of this research. The DNA inside a Black American person today is itself a historical document. It carries information that survived the Middle Passage, survived chattel slavery, survived every effort to sever the connection between Black Americans and their African origins. The 8,000-year-old bones did not create that connection. They revealed it. They gave scientists the tools to read a record that was always there, always present in living bodies, just waiting for the technology to make it legible. Funding for ancient African DNA research has historically lagged behind funding for research on ancient European or East Asian populations, partly because of the technical difficulties, and partly because of a long history of academic institutions in the global north directing resources toward their own ancestral histories. That is changing, slowly, as African scientists and scientists of African descent take a more prominent role in directing research agendas. Teams based at Harvard, Oxford, the University of Lagos, the University of Ghana, and several other institutions are actively expanding the number of ancient African genomes in the database. Each new ancient individual sequence adds another data point, another anchor in the timeline, another piece of the picture that resolves into something more complete. The findings also carry weight that goes beyond science. When we establish that Black Americans carry ancient West African genetic lineages dating back 8,000 years, we are establishing something about identity, about belonging, about the relationship between Black Americans and African heritage that has political and cultural dimensions as well as scientific ones. The argument that Black Americans are not African, that the African connection is merely symbolic or sentimental, that generations of life in America have produced a population with no meaningful biological link to the continent cannot survive contact with this evidence. The link is not symbolic. It is biological. It is ancient. It is documented. The bones have spoken. And what they say, in the precise language of genomic science, is that Black American history does not begin in 1619. It does not begin with the first slave ship. It does not begin with the Middle Passage or the auction block or the cotton field. It begins in West Africa, tens of thousands of years ago, with a people who developed in one of the most genetically complex and ancient populations on Earth. The enslavement, the forced migration, the deliberate severing of cultural memory, all of that happened. All of that was real and brutal and should never be minimized. But it did not erase the lineage. It could not. The DNA traveled across the ocean inside the bodies of people who did not choose to go. And it has been here ever since, waiting for science to catch up to what the bones always knew. 8,000 years ago, a woman died in West Africa, and the earth held her. Today, her lineage walks American streets, drives American roads, sits in American classrooms, raises American children, and builds American futures. She never knew any of that would happen, but it did. And now, finally, the science can say what the story always should have said. You were never disconnected from where you came from. You were never without roots. The roots were always there. They go down 8,000 years. They go down into the oldest inhabited land on Earth, and they are yours.
Picture it. The sky over